I did a project a couple years ago with folks at Amazon and Asana, and we looked at the number of switches that people made across tools in a day. And that number was high, but not surprising. What we thought was much more interesting was that people were spending roughly 50 minutes, that's 50 minutes a day, making decisions about what tool they should use next. That is a huge suck of time and resources, right? In anticipating what am I supposed to do next? And if you have those kinds of conversations going on in your organization, that's a sign that digital exhaustion is just sitting right there at the surface.
Welcome to Leadership, the podcast where leadership meets real-world insights. In each episode, you can eavesdrop on exclusive conversations with top thought leaders, best-selling authors, and experts in leadership, communication, relationships, culture, and everything else that shapes your effectiveness in the workplace and in your personal life. Leadership is here for you. Now, here's our host, himself a seasoned coach and best-selling author, Dr. Roger Dean Duncan.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Leadership, where we dive into smart thinking for today's leaders so you can navigate change, build stronger teams, and reclaim your energy. And remember, for free resources to help you in your leadership journey, go to leadership.net. That's leadership.net. For this episode, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Paul Leonardi. He received his PhD in management science at Stanford University and teaches at UC Santa Barbara. Paul has invested more than 2 decades in studying how technology reshapes attention, collaboration, and behavior. He's advised organizations such as Google, Microsoft, and General Motors on how to harness the power of digital tools. Paul is the author of an extremely timely book titled Digital Exhaustion: Simple Rules for Reclaiming Your Life. In our connected world, we all feel the drain, the endless ping of notifications, the multitasking, the mental fog when we finally get to the end of the day. Paul's research reveals that the problem is not how much time we spend online, it's how fragmented, reactive, and cognitively overloaded that time has become. Paul offers not a radical detox, but an evidence-based set of rules designed to help us recalibrate how we use technology, reclaim our attention and our emotional energy, and lead with more presence. Whether you're a leader trying to support your team, someone trying to lead your own life more effectively, or simply wondering how to use your devices without being used by them, you're going to find value in this conversation. Dr. Paul Leonardi, welcome to Leadership.
Thank you, Roger. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's begin with this. Many people think digital exhaustion just means too much screen time. How is your view different?
My view is actually pretty different. And, you gave such a nice overview, introduction of the concepts in this book. You said a lot of it, but let me try to extrapolate a bit. The issue that I see is that it's not that we spend too much time with our devices. We use our devices and all the applications on them for good reason. They do great things for us. We're able to have this wonderful chat because we have technology mediating our communication. The issue, though, is that the way that these technologies have been designed, the way they distract us, the way they pull our attention in different ways and in different places, the way they pique our emotions, the way they seem to show us a full picture when in reality they're only showing us pieces of it, are all the kinds of things that these tools do that really lead to this feeling of exhaustion that so many people have described to me over the years. And, by exhaustion, the typical response that people tell me is something like this. They'll say, Paul, I feel productive. I start my day energetic, but I switch between one project and another and a different application and a different device. And eventually I find myself just feeling blah, and I'm scrolling and I'm clicking and I'm not really sure I'm accomplishing anything. And I'm sucked in like a tractor beam, wanting to look at the screen, but also wanting to look away simultaneously. And then I just feel tired and I feel sad. That's the experience of digital exhaustion that I just hear people talk about over and over and over these days.
Well, it sounds very familiar.
Unfortunately, it does.
Yeah. Well, one of your core messages is it's not about a weekend digital detox. It's about reconnecting in better ways. And you offer 8 rules for doing that. Let's consider each one. Your first rule is stop using half your tools. Let me ask, how do you guide someone in practice to decide which tools to stop using?
Yeah. So it's an important question and an important set of strategies that we need to use to think about being able to eliminate some of the tools from the many that we use on a daily basis. And to start, I would say the big part of the reason why I advocate reducing the number of tools is that there is a tremendous amount of effort that goes unseen in having to switch across multiple tools and applications, not just daily, but almost by the minute. One of my favorite examples is, if you think about these video conferencing platforms that we use a lot, you could be on Zoom, you could switch to Microsoft Teams, you could switch to Google, WebEx. They all function relatively the same, except that the share button is in a slightly different place, and how you mute your mic is in a slightly different place. And those tiny little adjustments that we have to make as we're moving across all these platforms really add up and lead to this kind of exhaustion that I talk about. So reducing the number of switches that we have to do across platforms keeps us from having to deal with the constant change and intervention that these different kinds of tools bring. So how do you do that? Well, there's a couple of steps that I think help guide us there. The first is to try to take an inventory of what kind of tools exist as duplicates in our portfolio. So a lot of times, I'll find that people that are, let's say, graphic designers will use 2 or 3 different tools and that do roughly the same thing. And when I ask them, well, why do you use these 2 or 3 different tools? Most of the time their answers are, well, I learned how to use this one at this job and I learned to use this one. And so now I just kind of switch between them to do X, Y, and Z. But I don't have a real good rationale because it's not that the set of features is better on this one than on that one. The same thing happens when people are using video conferencing platforms, like I mentioned. They'll switch between one and another, not being super mindful about, should I be asking somebody, could we use Zoom rather than Teams for this particular meeting?
Right.
So once you recognize that you have a multiple number of tools that are doing roughly the same job, that's a good first step to be able to say, these are candidates that I could eliminate, right? I could swap out 2 and just go down to 1.
Makes a world of sense.
Yeah.
So rule number 2 is make a match. What does this mean, and how does it relate to work tools, personal tools, or hybrid settings?
Yeah. Make a match really is about identifying different kinds of capabilities that different technologies provide to us and trying to match them with the needs of our communication or decision making. So one of the things that we typically do, and I think this is true in most corporate America, is that we love to respond quickly to messages electronically and asynchronously. It just seems like it's less of a commitment, right? Somebody sends me an email. Even if it's a sort of a complex email, my default response is, I'm going to respond via email, or I'll shoot them a quick text. A lot of times that's the right approach for the job, meaning that the capabilities of the tool, quick communication, you're able to access it on a time that works easily for you. The message is not very complex. It's fairly straightforward and streamlined. It means there's a good match between the intention of my communication and the capabilities of the tool. But sometimes we're dealing with much more ambiguous situations that are complex, that require us to negotiate and reach some shared understanding, or me to read your cues to understand if you're following what I'm saying or upset. And when we communicate those messages via lean media, tools like email or chat or text or a direct message that don't allow us to convey a lot of the cues that would otherwise help us to resolve those ambiguities.
Nuances.
Yeah, exactly. We exacerbate the situation. So This has happened to me time and time again. Sometimes I'm a slow learner, where someone sends me kind of a troubled message. And rather than me recognize this is something that we need to sort out face to face, or at least on a Zoom call, we need to do it live so we can really work it back and forth. I send a note. Someone interprets it and sends it back. When we go back and forth, and now something that could have been resolved in, 4 or 5 minutes spreads over 2 or 3 days because there's a lag between when I receive the message. I start to make interpretations that person is mad at me, or that they're not respecting my time because they're not responding quickly enough.
Monsters of the mind.
You got it, right? And we do that so easily. So the important rule here is let's take a beat and make a match between the complexity of the problem we're trying to solve and the capabilities of the tool that will allow us to do the job. You do that, and you definitely will reduce your exhaustion.
I feel better already. So rule number 3 is batch and stream. Can you share an example of batching versus streaming that many listeners might find surprising?
Sure. So batching refers to processing a bunch of information all at once. And that could be that I'm reading through a bunch of reports and I'm going to do that all together, in a 1-hour block of time. Or it could be I'm going to take my emails and I'm going to respond to them all right in half an hour, or devote, 45 minutes or whatever it might be. That's batching. Streaming is the opposite strategy, which is I deal with things right as they come in. So I get a new report, I read it, I send out a response. I get a new message that comes in, I read it, I respond right away. Both represent very different strategies for how we process information. Batching allows us to focus in one area, get things done, and then move on to something else. So we were done, we disconnect, and then we reconnect to something else. Streaming has us constantly moving back and forth across different areas of work, different kinds of flows, different pieces of information. And what the research shows is that streaming tends to be more exhausting for us because we're making more of those mental switches really quickly. The problem, though, is that if we say, I'm only going to, let's say, return all of my emails at 4 o'clock every single day, then we're likely to be holding people up and missing some important context throughout the day. So the more ideal strategy is to figure out how can we create blocks of time so that we are investing our effort in doing a concentrated set of work and then moving to a different task, but also making sure that we're periodically scanning the environment so that we know are things coming in that we need to deal with, and then we deal with them in the right kind of orders.
Right.
So the rule is really about know that there are these two modes for how we can process information and figure out what's the right balance and the right strategy depending on your personality, depending on the kind of work that you're in, and depending on the kind of time crunch that you find yourself in.
So rule number 4, you suggest waiting 1 hour, 1 day, 1 week. In today's world, why does waiting become kind of a radical act of control?
Radical is probably the right word for it. This is the rule that I think I get the most pushback on from people, who say, well, waiting is rude. We're supposed to respond right away. And what I'd say to that is we live in a culture in which we have come to expect instantaneous replies, or we at least anticipate that others expect instantaneous replies of us.
Well, it might be argued that expecting somebody to drop everything and respond to you instantaneously is also rude.
Yeah, and very self-centered.
Disrespectful.
Right, very egotistical, I would say.
Right.
But I think that what the research demonstrates to us is that we tend to overestimate how urgent other people's requests are. And so we think someone needs a response right away when, unless they tell us they need a response right away, the odds are they probably don't. And why wait then? Why not just respond? Well, there's a couple of important things. The first is that many problems resolve themselves with a little bit of waiting. I'm sure you can think, Roger, of lots of examples where somebody's reached out to you and said, hey, I need this right away. And you weren't able to respond. And then they get back to you and say, oh, no, I figured it out.
Right.
Our natural response when we run into problems is let's reach out to somebody and ask for help. And what waiting does is it encourages someone to really say, okay, could I resolve this myself? And if not, then I'll reach out to Paul or I'll reach out to Roger. The second thing that waiting really does is it slows down the cadence of our interactions. So people tend to entrain on other people's response patterns. So if you send me an email and I take a bit to respond, then you'll likely take a little bit to respond. If you send an email and I respond right away, you're statistically more likely to respond right away. If we can break that fast response cycle and slow down, that gives us more time to process information, to give more complete responses. And what we see is that people who give longer, more thoughtful responses tend not to get as many follow-up questions, which means that you'll get fewer interruptions later so that you won't have to do as much streaming like we talked about in rule number 3.
That reminds me of something my very smart wife taught me decades ago, long before digital anything, when we had memos, and I wrote a memo to one of my colleagues, and it was on kind of a touchy subject. It needed to be addressed, and I showed my wife the memo. And she said, "This is very well done. You've thought it through very carefully. I suggest you put it in your desk drawer and leave it there for at least 24 hours. And when you read it again, if you still want to send it, send it." Well, I didn't send it.
Yeah. I've been in that situation many times too.
I just waited. Well, there's something about our digital world that makes that kind of hard sometimes. You've said it very well.
Yeah, and I think it's a good reminder that even though the tendency might be to respond quickly, there's a power in thinking about our responses, being thoughtful and mindful about who our audience is. And in the long run, it does us a lot of good because, like your example just showed, we can stop problems from happening if we're just a bit more thoughtful and, taking more care in figuring out our responses.
Exactly. Well, your rule number 5 sort of relates to some of the other rules. Don't assume. What assumptions are most dangerous in digital habits, especially for leaders?
Yeah. Well, we're in an interesting kind of era where it appears like all the information is available to us, right? You see people's posts on social media. ChatGPT gives you a really robust account of whatever question that you asked it. And it looks like we see things that are complete. And so it's easy for us to then make assumptions about other people's motives, about their actions, their activities, because it looks like we have all the information. The reality, though, is it only appears that we have a lot of information, right? We're only seeing a curated view of the world. We're only seeing bits and pieces of the full picture of somebody's life. And so a big part of the problem of digital exhaustion is that we tend to create assumptions that drive our behaviors about what other people's motives and intentions and actions are that tend to create lots of friction. So unfortunately, the research suggests, we tend to kind of assume the worst about lots of folks and we don't give people enough benefit of the doubt. If you took a social psychology class at some point, you remember probably the fundamental attribution error, right? That
Exactly.
We tend to think that things that happen to us are outside chance, and the things that other people do are because they made purposeful decisions to do it. And when we suffer those kinds of problems, we end up in this spiral in which it becomes really difficult to interact with others because we're always kind of assuming we understand where they come from, and then we start in a certain place and we end up not doing the right thing. And so if we can just remember that the pieces of data that we have don't say more than what they show, that we can't be taking extra inferences and making extra assumptions, then we just do better and we reduce our exhaustion.
All of these rules, again, make such a world of sense. And everything you've described, I think I could say applies to virtually every person I've ever met. These are very human things.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a character flaw at all that we have these issues. We just need to be more aware, which kind of brings us to rule number 6, which is always be intentional.
That's right.
So how do you build the habit of intention around impulse behaviors like picking up a phone or opening a new app?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is that all of our devices and the applications on them are designed to pull us in. And a lot of people that I talk to have told me they use the metaphor of a tractor beam, that their phone is sitting there on the counter in the kitchen and they just feel like they're being pulled into it, whether they want to or not. And they're designed to pull us in, right? All those applications that pop up messages at random intervals, the excitement and surprise of seeing what's new. So one of the most powerful things that we can do is remember that every time we are picking up a phone or we're logging on to our computer, there's a reason that we sat down to do that. And there's an activity that we want to accomplish. And if we can set some ground rules for ourselves to say, look, I'm logging on right now because I need to check my bank account balance. And that means I'm going to log on, check my bank account balance, do the things I need to do, and then log off. There's a much higher success rate that you won't fall into the trap of clicking on another web browser and going into a different app and spiraling out of control, scrolling and clicking. But if you don't set those intentions ahead of time and you just kind of pick up your phone and you like, oh, I'm just going to look at some things, 45 minutes, an hour can go by
Right.
very, very easily. So setting those intentions is really important. And as you said, sometimes we need a little help. So, people that I talk to give me all kinds of different ideas and rules for that. Some are kind of as silly as like, somebody told me one time, I like to make sure that I put a random game password on my phone so that it makes me guess what I've got 4 or 5 passwords. And so there's an app I can use that will make me guess what password it is. So it just gives a little bit of friction so that as I'm logging in, I remember, oh yeah, the whole point of me putting in this little game on this password was so that I don't spend too much time on the phone, so that I remember to do my thing and log off. Other people will do much more simple things like, put their phone in a different room so that you have to go and get it rather than it just being available to you. Whatever the hack is that is useful, as long as it prompts you to think, oh yeah, the reason that I did this, the reason I put this obstacle in was so that I'll remember to be intentional when I use it. I think that accomplishes the goal nicely.
Your change initiative has the budget. The strategy looks solid, and everyone's nodding along in the meetings. But for some reason, it's going nowhere. Dr. Roger Dean Duncan knows why. After 40 years in the trenches with top business leaders, he knows that change fails when organizations lack the right foundations: trust, accountability, and real communication. Dr. Duncan's free 10-minute assessment shows you exactly where your organization stands. Answer a few straightforward questions that reveal your true change readiness level. Don't waste months discovering the hard way. Get your free assessment today at leadershop.net/change. Again, that's leadershop.net/change.
Well, speaking of hacks, one of my favorite, and fortunately I haven't had to use it. A lot of people, as you likely know, risk their lives and the lives of others because they text while they drive.
Oh, yeah.
And one hack that I've seen is putting nail polish on your thumb, your right thumb, because if you pick up the phone, you're going to see that thumb, and it's going to remind you, put the phone down before you kill somebody.
That's a great idea.
And they've done studies that show that that's very simple hack really does work. It gets people out of the habit of texting while they're driving.
Yeah, it's a great example of just a little intervention that jogs our memory and reminds us we actually are in control and we make decisions. That's what we need to gain that freedom back.
Exactly. Well, your rule number 7 is learn to see around corners.
Yeah.
How does predictive awareness help us avoid exhaustion?
Sure. So many of the rules that we've talked about so far are about reducing the amount of exhaustion we feel, right? So reducing that drain in our metaphorical battery. But these last 2 rules are really about how do we recharge and build the energy back up. One of the best things that we can do when we're in kind of our online environments is stumble upon or find our way into new pieces of information and knowledge that make us happy, enjoy us, provide us with new skills or lessons that we can use.
Right.
And a lot of people that I've talked to talk about this, that they'll sort of create opportunities for serendipity to happen. They'll find, at work, right, that I'm going to go read through a Slack channel that is not one that I typically participate in, so that I can just get a sense of what are other people doing and who has knowledge or expertise in what areas.
Right.
And people report that when they break out of their typical silos and they're moving and looking in different areas, that they feel energized and empowered because they learn new things about new people and new opportunities and new strategies for how they might do their work differently.
It's kind of like deliberate serendipity.
That's right. It's, sort of recognizing that if I break out of my normal patterns and I move into a different community or a different space where I could learn something, and you go in with the intention to actually see what I could find out and see what I can learn, that's when our tools are at their best for us. That's when they help connect us to new pieces of knowledge and information that make us excited and build our energy back up.
Well, your rule number 8, and all of these fit together so nicely, I think. Your rule number 8 is be here, not there.
Yeah.
What are the leadership implications of this rule when applied in meetings, remote work, and hybrid teams?
Great question. There was just a fantastic piece in the Wall Street Journal the other day about CEOs getting upset about people texting and multitasking during meetings.
Right.
And I know I had a good chuckle about this because, yes, from an exhaustion standpoint, it's a huge problem. If we're moving back and forth across these different domains, like we talked about, this is going to be a significant source of our digital fatigue and overwhelm, right? We're just not good as humans at multitasking and pulling out from one domain and moving into another. We think we're good at it, but our brains just can't make that switch fast enough, and it costs us a lot of metabolic energy to make those transitions. So yes, it's absolutely a problem if people are moving across multiple platforms and, multitasking and being in multiple places, figuratively, right, rather than just in the meeting. I think part of the problem is on the participants' side, which is that you have to really work to be here, be in the moment, and tell ourselves that, yes, I could be transported to lots of different places if I just looked at this app or got onto this news feed or, looked at my email here. But the value of this interaction is about me being fully present and engaging with the material at hand.
Right.
But the other problem often, I think, comes from the side of the people that are leading these meetings. Because if you're not creating an environment that is requiring someone to be there and to be stimulated and to be fully present, they're automatically going to be gravitating towards all these different tools that they have to teleport out of your meeting and be other places.
Sometimes it doesn't occur to the meeting leader that the meeting leader might be a big part of the problem.
That's true. And this goes back again to, I think, if we think about our rule number 2, which was make a match, if you've created a meeting context in really which all you're doing is you're talking as the leader, or you're providing updates that probably could have been done much more efficiently via email. In other words, you're doing tasks in a meeting that don't really require people to be physically co-present with one another and interact. You've probably not made the right match for that meeting. And so you're encouraging people to not be there in the meeting mentally.
So how can leaders recognize when their team is suffering from digital exhaustion, even if they aren't complaining explicitly?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the key signs is that you see a decrease in productivity. And this has been something that I've seen over the 20 years of doing this research, that you have people that are very engaged. They say that they are kind of working at the top of their game, but you're not seeing the kind of output that you expect from people on your team. If you know that you've provided them the right resources, that you've got the right skills on your team, but you're generally seeing this gradual reduction in the amount of productivity, that's a likely sign that you have people that are overwhelmed by too many tools. Another example, and I think this is just a really easy sign, is that if you have a lot of discussion happening in your organization about which tools you should be using for which kinds of tasks, that means you have way too many tools and people are feeling overwhelmed. I did a project a couple of years ago with folks at Amazon and Asana, and we looked at the number of switches that people made across tools in a day. And that number was high, but not surprising. What we thought was much more interesting was that people were spending roughly 50 minutes, that's 50 minutes a day, making decisions about what tool they should use next. That is a huge suck of time and resources, right? In anticipating what am I supposed to do next? And if you have those kinds of conversations going on in your organization, that's a sign that digital exhaustion is just sitting right there at the surface.
Well, that certainly adds up.
It certainly does.
Well, for a senior executive, what diagnostic questions would you ask to assess whether the organization is at risk of digital exhaustion? What kind of questions would you ask?
Mm-hmm. One of the questions that I usually go in and ask is, okay, how many different software licenses do you support in the organization? And the answer is often surprising. What I typically hear is there'll be a number that'll come from, let's say, the CEO usually doesn't know, but the CIO or the CTO will say, we've got, like 60 software licenses. And then when they actually go look it up, it's almost usually 1.5 to 2 times as many as they thought. And that's largely because the way that, a lot of software vendors hawk their wares these days is that they figure out, okay, well, what's the price point that any manager can just charge on their corporate card to get right below the radar and get their team on board on tool A, B, or C. And so you can have this rampant proliferation of tools across the organization. And once there are so many, it's hard to get people to winnow them down because you have multiple people on a platform and depending on one another. And so one person can't easily just decide, well, I don't want to use this platform anymore because you expect me to be on it. That's where you need some senior leadership intervention. You need people coming in and saying, look, you need to justify for me why we need 3 different kinds of instant messaging platforms. And if we don't, we're deciding we're going with one and that's it. So that's one easy diagnostic. Just look at the number of licenses you've got, and there's a high correlation between the amount of exhaustion that exists in your organization and just the number of tools that you see.
Kind of reminds me of the number of apps that you see on your TV screen, and over time those really start to add up.
Oh yeah.
And then you realize you haven't watched the Disney Channel or whatever for 3 years, but you're paying for it every month.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So let's switch gears here a little bit in terms of place.
Sure.
For parents and people at home, how do your rules translate into the non-work environment? Family life, children, personal downtime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you asked this question because I've spent most of my career working with organizations. And I didn't think when I started doing the research for this book that I'd probably have a lot to say to parents and people outside of work. But what really struck me in all the interviews that I did was the amount of exhaustion that parents in particular talked about feeling in managing and coordinating their lives outside of work. That you've got kids that are playing soccer and going to music lessons and school times change, that when school's out, changes from Tuesday to Thursday and Monday and Wednesday. And there's so much coordination that needs to happen across all kinds of different applications and technologies that managing your schedule and the schedule of your kids and your family members and coordinating with your friends becomes this complex multi-point coordination problem across so many different tools. And people really were suffering and talking about how difficult it is to remain energetic around this. So a couple of ways that these rules that we talked about intersect. I think the make a match rule is an important one here. So one of the things that I heard a lot was, I'll give you the example of parents trying to coordinate carpools. So they would tell me, if I add up the amount of hours that I spend per week, and it's hours, not minutes, hours per week, coordinating via text message about who's going to pick the kid up from volleyball and who's going to take them, to ballet practice or whatever it might be, that I actually spend more time in some cases coordinating the carpool than just driving the kid myself.
Right.
So if you think about it that way, why is all of this complex coordination taking so much time? Well, you have a week that has multiple activities, that things are going to be changing and evolving. To have to explain with 3 or 4 people in a sequential way on a set of text messages how your weekly schedule is going to impact their weekly schedule is a very complex process that text messages are not really well set up to facilitate. So rather than do that, the parents that overcame their digital exhaustion the most successfully would take different strategies. They would arrange a group phone call, maybe once a week, where they'd get the 3 parents that were involved in the carpool and they'd hash out a plan, and that took them 10 minutes to do for the week, rather than 35 minutes coordinating via text messaging. So if we reorient to the problem, not as just a bunch of sequential interactions, but a complex coordination issue, then we can make a new match with our technology and ease a lot of our exhaustion. So that's one way that one of these simple rules, I think, can apply really well to our non-work domain.
So, Paul, when someone has implemented your 8 rules, how do they sustain the momentum? How do they avoid sliding back into old habits?
Yeah, I love that question. And what I've seen is that people maintain most of their momentum when they start small. So they pick 1 or 2 rules that they think are the most impactful for their situation. And the reason that I talk about all 8 of these rules in the book is that not every rule is going to work for you and your situation. And so you have a compendium of rules here that can, in different combinations, probably help you with whatever your situation is. So if you start with 1 or 2 of them that you think is going to be the most useful and you commit to sticking with them, I see much less backsliding than people that are trying to say, I'm going to do all of these at once because all of these are great ideas. We just can't handle that much change simultaneously. And we set ourselves up for failure if we try to implement a rule that's ill-adjusted to our situation. So you might think, well, great, I want to reduce half my tools. That's a rule that should work for me. And you find out, it actually doesn't, that one is not the most helpful for my own work situation. I just don't have enough autonomy to get rid of half these tools. If you try that and you fail early, it sets you on a downward spiral and makes it really difficult to start with a different rule. So I really suggest you pick the 1 or 2 that feel most well adjusted to your own sense of exhaustion in your own situation. You start there, and then there's going to be much less backsliding.
Dr. Paul Leonardi, thank you so much for joining us on Leadership. Paul reminds us that the goal isn't to escape technology, it's to reshape our relationship with it. He offers a roadmap not for disconnection, but for discernment. In a world that rewards speed and saturation, reclaiming our attention is a radical act of leadership. So here's the challenge. What is one digital habit you'll change this week? Not to do less, but to think more clearly, connect more deeply, and lead more intentionally. If you found this episode valuable, please share it with your team, your network, or anyone else who's ready to make better use of their time and attention. And be sure to leave a review. Even a single sentence fuels the algorithms that promote the great content that the Leadership podcast offers. And for free resources to help you in your leadership journey, go to leadership.net. That's leadership.net. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time, stay safe, be happy, and spread good cheer wherever you go. For Leadership, I'm Roger Dean Duncan.